this video I'm going to redesign the Plymouth Voyager into something that could be built today. We're not going to focus on the very early Plymouth Voyager, which by the way looked fantastic, such cool vans. We're going to focus on the 1984 model when Chrysler came in the picture with the Dodge Caravan as well. And we're going to take some inspiration from the new Charger Daytona, apply that design language onto the bodywork of a 1984 Voyager and see how that is going to turn out. So before we do that, let's have a look at this model, what it's actually looks like. So this is the top trim. You know this is the top trim because it has these wood panels on the side, which is very typical 80s. I love this styling, even though it's not my personal taste. It just feels very old school and specific for this era. The Voyager was actually Chrysler's first ever minivan, and they showed some sketches in the early beginnings of the 70s to potential customers of the minivan sketches that they had of the time, and they said that it looked ugly, so they had to go back to the drawing board and come up with something else. And this is the design that it came up with. It was very underpowered. It has about 96 horsepower in the base model. We're going to talk more about the spec and tech when we jump into the redesign. But overall, I kind of like this styling, this boxy shape that we have. It also had an option to have a bed in the rear, so you could have, instead of having the seating here, you could rotate the seating in the back and then fold down an entire bed back here to do some camping in. Very cool design overall, and I do think it would just modernize a couple of features here while keeping the overall proportions, the boxy proportions that I feel is coming back a little bit today. We could come out with a pretty cool design. So let's jump in to the redesign here and let's see how this is going to turn out. Now, there were 3 generations of the Voyager from 1984 to 2000. Now, in 1984, Chrysler marketed and rebadged Plymouth variant of its new minivan as the Voyager using the Chrysler S platform. It shared a lot of components with other cars such as the Reliance Instruments cluster and dashboard controls, for example. It was also strictly front wheel drive only. In '87, the Voyager received minor cosmetic updates, sort of a facelift, as well as the 1987 introduction of the Grand Voyager. So they increased the wheelbase a little bit and added more cargo room for 1987. Minivans were offered in 3 trim levels, with the base level being completely unnamed. It didn't have a name for the base model. That's how base that model was. And then you had the mid-level SE and the high-end LE. You can spot the LE if you have this wood grain on the side, paneling on the side of the car. A sportier LX model was also introduced in 1989. It was very underpowered, and it wasn't very safe either. So this first generation Voyager, it lacked safety features such as airbags. It didn't even have ABS braking. However, the Voyager, along with the Dodge Caravan, are considered to be the first mass-produced vehicles to include dedicated cup holders. And now you can't imagine buying a new car and it doesn't have cup holders unless it's a hypercar or something like that. For the interior, this could be equipped with 5, 6, or 7 passenger, and you also had an 8 passenger variant available only in 1985. And in 1985 and 86, there was also 5 passenger versions, like we talked about in the beginning, with a back seat that could be folded flat with the pull of a handle into a bed that filled the rear compartment from the back of the front seats all the way to the rear, creating a pretty large bed, and this was known as the Magic Camper. When it comes to the engines, it was available with 2 inline 4 cylinders for the first 3 years, with a base 2.2 liter, and this is the one that had 96 horsepower. When you think about the horsepower numbers here, Chrysler wanted to be in the same level as other competitors from other markets, not in the US, and they had similar power. So this, considering that this was a minivan, for the time, it wasn't really underpowered compared to the competition. You also had an optional Mitsubishi 2.6 liter engine producing 104 horsepower, so not a huge bump there. If you go for the from the 2.2 with 96 to the 2.6, then you get 104 horsepower. However, these engines were replaced after 3 years, and in the mid-1987, the base 2.2 liter was in fact replaced with a 2.5 liter inline six. Still very low on power. This one had 100 horsepower. You also had a V6 now, a Mitsubishi sourced 3-liter V6 producing 136 horsepower. So at least a little bit of a bump with the V6. And later on, you also had a turbocharged version of the 2.5-liter Mitsubishi engine. And this one is as much power as you're going to get in the first generation Voyager, and that came out to 150 horsepower. Both a 3-speed automatic transmission and you also had a 5-speed manual were available with all inline 4 engines. The V6s only came as automatics. And overall, this was a huge project and a huge risk to take by Chrysler building the first ever minivan, and it turned out to be a huge success, and we still have Chrysler minivans to this date. So with that said, let's jump in and have a look at this redesign and what's going on here. So I wanted to see, the new Charger Daytona has a very boxy shape to it, and I think that front end specifically could be applied onto the boxy shape of the 1984 Plymouth Voyager, and overall I do think it actually worked. I also worked a little bit with the proportions, because in the 1984 version we have these 80s proportions, meaning that the greenhouse stretches very high up and the body, almost like 50% of the height of the car. That's where you have the shoulder line. I wanted to make it a little bit more sporty, a little bit more modern. When we do that though, we got to be careful so it doesn't turn into a wagon, and that means that we still need to have a pretty high sitting front end and a short hood to have these classic minivan proportions. It also only had 2 doors, this specific Voyager, so I'm not going to put any doors on the rear half of this minivan. I'm going to keep it with the 2 doors that we have from 1984. And since this is supposed to be a modern car, we also need to lower it further to the ground, and I think the graphics and the parts from the Charger Daytona really helps plant this car properly, and also added the wheels and tire setup. But I'm not going to make the rear tire too fat in this case, since this originally was a front-wheel drive car. Even though I was tempted to make it 335mm wide tires in the rear, I'm not going to do that for this specific redesign. I also switched up the side mirrors and covered up some features or details in the hood, for example, that definitely shows that it would be an 80s car. And overall, I think the result is pretty cool. It will be a nice addition to the current Chrysler lineup to have the Charger Daytona front end applied to a minivan proportions like this. I'm not sure if this would work as an EV. I would probably want to have at least a V6 in this, and definitely more horsepower than 96 horsepower. Maybe bump it up to 200 or 250 horsepower, something like that, and we would have a proper cool looking little minivan.